page Lamed Beis. So, in this second part of the book, which is dedicated to the Esser Spheros, the first part of which is speaking specifically about the Keser, which elaborates on more than any of the other Spheros to come, by discussing at least 8 aspects of Keser, which we can emulate. Not only emulating Keser in general, but emulating Keser in 8 specific subcategories. The first one was through the humility of Keser. And we did the second as well, which is that the person's thoughts should be directed in the manner of Keser, which is that they should be pure and not tainted with any type of impurity. So that brings us up to then the third aspect. So that's Lamed Gimel. Mitzcho lo hiyebo koshi klal. Furthermore, if a person wants to emulate the Midah of Keser, he has to be careful that his forehead should not be hard. What is that referring to?
Stubbornness, maybe?
Very good. That's a good guess. Okay, that's a good suggestion. Let's see if we...
Maybe...
Go ahead.
Well, as like... I don't know if this is correct, but when you're a child, there's a soft spot on your forehead. And then as you grow, the spot closes. So
that's an interesting idea, yeah.
And that's where you put on the tefillin?
Yeah, that's called, I think, the fontanelle, or fontanelle. But it's more, yeah, it's not, I mean, it's really up here, I think, in your cranium. Yeah. But I guess it's like an extension in your forehead. So according to that, meaning like, don't have a hard forehead, have a soft forehead, which means keep your mind open for divine influence. The tefillin comes, like you're mentioning, there. Yeah, the tefillin was right there, right in the juncture where that soft spot was. Yeah, leave that hole open as much as you can to, as an adult, be able to continue to experience the awe, and the wonder, and the spectacularly tantalizing enthusiasm for the realization of the presence of God. But let's see. Ashlishis mitzcho lo yebo koshi klal. The forehead should have no hardness at all. Ele yidmei tomid lemetzach haratzon. Rather, he should constantly be making himself like the forehead of Ratzon. Sheyiratze esakol, which will favor and find favor in all. So, insofar as the metzach, the forehead, is the frontalmost part of our body in which the mind is contained, the forehead kind of corresponds to and is related to the presentation or the positing of one's mind, right? So that a person's thoughts, which are in his mind, are most formally perceivable on his forehead, which is the frontal part of that, that encasement for his thoughts. And therefore it has to do with ratzon. Ratzon is will. And you can have good will, or a person can have bad will. But the point here is that Keser is like that forehead. Why is Keser like the forehead? Because above Keser is the divine will to create. And that thought, right, is kind of coming to the fore in the realm of creation in Keser. And we spoke about how Keser, the sphere of Keser, has within it Chochmah, Bin, and Das, which are the faculties of wisdom, understanding, and knowledge. So that Keser is bulging with divine will, and therefore it's like that forehead which is making a presentiment of, or presenting, divine will. And that divine will is good. It's beneficial. And therefore a person's forehead should not be stern, right? Which would convey thoughts of tension or of judgment, of din, but rather the forehead should be soft. It shouldn't be hardened, it should be soft. So that the thoughts that are being presented, well, the thoughts behind it, and the thoughts which are being conveyed and presented by the metzach, by the keser, are going to be good thoughts. Okay? This is very important. I think this is what he means. So that just like the divine will bulges through and is presented by keser, which is like the forehead, right, revealing the divine thoughts, so our thoughts should also be positive and not negative. Should be beneficial. And this is the metzach aratzon. Sheyiratze esakol, he should find favor in the eyes of all and also favor all. Afilu sheyimtza b'nei adam koasim, and even if he finds people who are angry, yiratze v'yashkitem b'ratzono hatov, he should appease them and quiet them with his goodwill. So if you find, for example, two people arguing, right? Everybody's got their forehead all flared up, one against the other, and they're shouting and arguing and so forth and so on. And a person wants to try and mediate between the two, right? Just try and separate them and pull one aside, and speak calmly, right? Speak calm to the person, calm the person down, say words that are calming and soothing. Yeah, but if you go in there and you start shouting, and so you're likely to get in the broil, right? And you're only going to stir up these people's anger even more than it was before. So that's what he's saying here, that a person should have a soft forehead, not a hard forehead, a soft forehead where he is able to calmly interact with other people, and if there's tension, he can diffuse that tension, right? All in order for the divine influence to flow into the world in a very fluid and serene, a pleasant type of a way. Sheken metzach haratzon hu tamid rotze umeratze hagavurus umisaknam. And this is like the metzach haratzon, what I was referring to before, the forehead of will that is the sphera of keser, which is impregnated with divine will coming from on high. It's constantly appeasing, soothing out, nullifying judgments. That's gvuros. Gvuros are like the sphere of gvura, which has to do with din or judgments. So too, we should also try and calm down and placate. Doesn't necessarily mean to give into, but to calm down people who are overcome with their anger and judgment and so forth and so on. V'hu yinalem beratzon tov, and in this way he can guide them with his goodwill. V'yishatef sham chochma gadola, and intermingle there with great wisdom. Lahash bisakas, in order to quiet the anger. Shelo yavor hagvul. V'yakalkel has v'shalom, in order that anger should not spill over its boundaries and cause harm and damage, God forbid. V'yaseh dugma l'rotzoin ha'elyon, and in this way he is emulating the will on high, shehu nimshach min hochma, which comes through hochma hanifloa b'mitzcha da'atika, which comes through the hochma, which is inside the keser. That is the supernal and wondrous mitzcha da'atika, the ancient primordial forehead, right? Again, referring to keser, umisham miratze kol, and from there everything is calmed down. So, what he's saying is that divine will is channeled down through the primary sphere of keser. That is like the metzach. It has within it the chokhmah and the bina. Chokhmah is to the right, and what it's saying is that the influence coming down through keser, which is the metzach, the representation of the divine will, should be directed towards the right, the sphere of keser, of chokhmah. And chokhmah, wisdom, is like I said, is aligned to the right and therefore associated with chesed, and not din, as opposed to bina, to the left, which is talking about din and judgment. It's not necessarily negative in bina, However, Bina does give birth to Gvura, below it, to the left. And therefore, even though the flow has to go down through all of the spheros and be properly balanced between them, it doesn't necessarily have to be in the middle. A proper balance is viewed as being towards the right. There's going to be a mixture between right and left, but it's going to be leaning towards the right. And therefore, whenever we talk about the spheros, connecting to the spheros, influencing the flow through the spheros, generally what we want to be doing is thinking about it and thinking about ways in which we can direct the divine flow always to the right, to the center or to the right of the spheros, and not to the left, where the left is judgment. And that's what he's saying here too, therefore. When there's anger, therefore in the physical realm, there's an argument, there's a machlokes, then a person should use the metzach of the Ratzon Elyon, the forehead of this divine will on high, in order to direct divine will towards chokhmah, just like when in diffusing an argument, one would use chokhmah to try and say the right things in the right way to the right person at the right time in order to smooth things over. That's all for the purpose of bringing about chesed, which is underneath the chokhmah, right? Remember this? You got keser, chokhmah, bina, das, and then chesed and gvura. Chesed underneath the chokhmah, and gvura underneath the bina, to the left. And this will flow naturally as a result of his always being in a very easy, relaxed, comfortable state with people. Because if a person's attributes are difficult, demanding, and here I think he's making reference again to the metzach kashe, where he's telling us a person should not have this hard-headedness. Mitzad echad in bnei adam, if he is too strong with people, lo yisratze mimeno, people won't like him. Why? Because he's stern. He's stern. He's aloof, and he's not kind. He's not personable, and therefore people will not. They won't relate to him, and he won't be able to have any influence over people either. It's not the point that I don't mean to say that a person should be looking to influence others, but we all influence one another. We all share with one another. And a person who's stern and austere and aloof is going to be outside of the loop of benefiting humanity. That's the point. He's not going to be able to give. V'zeh tam Mishnah, and this is the reason of the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos, Perek Gimel, Mishnah Yod Gimel, chapter 3, Mishnah 13. Kol sharuach habriyos noicha hemena, anybody who other people are pleased with, ruach hamakam noicha hemeno, so the Spirit of God is pleased with this person as well. This has to be put in perspective, right? If a person is, for example, we learned the Gemara where there was a particular person, Safta ben Alis, I think his name was, who hired out his mule as a carrier service for some non-Jewish woman, remember? And they passed by the Baal Peor, and she said to this Jewish mule driver, wait, I'm going to go in and do the deed and come out. And she did. And then he went in and she said, aren't you Jewish? And he said, what do you care? And he went in and he did what he did and he came out. Remember there, he actually improved the worship of Baal Peor in a most disgusting way, which had never been seen before and everybody was all pleased and they lauded and praised him. So we're clearly not talking about finding favor in people's eyes where the people themselves are, when the people themselves are behemoths, when the people themselves are wicked, and the things that they appreciate and admire are wicked. But we're talking about, on the other hand, we're not necessarily talking about righteous people who value the most righteous things either. Talking about really more specifically your average general Joe Jew or your average person. Is this person desired, and do people find favor with him or not? If they do, it's a sign that God finds favor with them as well. Certainly he has to be involved in Torah and mitzvos, and he has to be with groups of people who are also oriented in that direction as well. But here we're talking about somebody who's large enough to be able to be doing the right things with the right people, and also find favor in the eyes of people who are, your average, mediocre type of people as well. If he can find favor in the eyes of people who are wicked, doing wicked things, without being like them and doing what they do, then that would be even more laudable. Right? Such a person would be a true tzaddik, where he's totally immersed in righteous things and he's doing the will of God. He also finds favor in the eyes of your average people, meaning he can come down and relate to people and talk to them about many different things and be around them, and they can feel comfortable in his presence. And he might even gain the admiration of people who generally don't appreciate people who are good or doing good things, if he's powerful enough, and draw people from that dark side in the direction of tshuva as well. So that's what we're talking about here. Any person who finds favor in the eyes of the world, and again, we're talking generally. I think my understanding is we're talking about your average, middle of the road people. So anybody who finds favor in the eyes of these people, so he finds favor in God's eyes as well. This would be an example of somebody who does not have a metzach kashe; he has a metzach rach, right? Meaning his forehead is not hard-headed, and therefore insular, aloof, in a way which might be perceived as being only self-interested. Rather, the person has got more of an open mind, and he's able to engage and encounter many different people in many different contexts, and have a favorable, positive impression on many different types of people. That would be this, the metzach, which is not kashe, a metzach which has ratzon. Okay? So that would be the third way, the third aspect of emulating Keser. I was elaborating a bit for the last few minutes on maybe just like a general approach to life as far as this third aspect is concerned. But maybe we could speak of a few specific examples as well. Usually people think that rabbis or a Torah scholar or somebody who's committed to Torah is like I said before, insular, aloof, standoffish, or so involved in Torah and Torah learning and the performance of the mitzvahs that they really don't relate to the real world or things like that. They can't come down. But that might be true, but that's not the Torah teaching about the way things should be. That would be an expression of smallness within Torah. But a person is encouraged to attain a level of greatness within Torah, which would be, like we learned earlier regarding the Keser, much more inclusive than insular. And therefore we find even Moshe Rabbeinu, who was the greatest Torah scholar of all times, he was up on Mount Sinai for 40 days and 40 nights without eating or drinking, subsisting without sleep or food, purely on a divine connection with God that would seem to be that he was kind of separate and distant from the people, his being way up in the mountain and their being way down below at the base of the mountain. We discussed in the morning class Chazal that said the people were actually underneath the mountain. If you remember, we discussed that a bit. Yeah? So you couldn't imagine a scenario where you had more of a dichotomy, a distinction between the Torah scholar par excellence and the people, the lay people, lying in the low. Yet nevertheless we find that when Moshe Rabbeinu came down from Sinai, he gave the Torah to the men, he gave the parts of the Torah that pertained to the women, and he also, the Midrash says, came down with candies and nuts and sweet things for the children. So to the men and women he gave the Torah, each one according to what was appropriate to them, but he didn't forget the children. They couldn't understand the Torah, but he gave them nuts and candies and things. So Moshe Rabbeinu, despite the fact that he had been living this hermit-like existence for 40 days and 40 nights on the top of the mountain, separated from the people, when he was receiving the Torah, he became so full of Torah that it didn't distance himself from the people. On the contrary, he was able to come down from the mountain and get down right down to their level. Even to the children he thought of and he provided for. So you see from here that it's not necessarily the case, and it's really not ideally the case at all, that a person should, because of his Torah, become hard-headed, as it were, right? With a hard forehead. But on the contrary, it should make him, if his Torah learning is true, it should make him more empathetic towards all other people as well. And there's a similar story about a particular rabbi. I don't remember the name of the rabbi now. But he and his congregation would get up very early every morning in order to daven the first minyan, which is the Netz minyan, to time their prayer with the sunrise. And this was whether it was in the summer, which was quite early in the morning, of course, and it's difficult to get up that early. And it's also in the winter, even though it was later, so sunrise is later in the winter, it's much colder, of course, and therefore it's difficult to get up when it's dark and cold. But this is what he did day in and day out, year after year, summer, winter, summer, winter. One year, one day in the winter, it snowed very heavily, and people were leaving their houses trying to make their way to shul, and they noticed a figure that looked like it was like dancing or moving or doing something in the snow. And people were taken a bit back by it. It was like a scepter that early in the morning. Who or what would be messing around with the snow like that? So they came a bit closer with some slight apprehension because of the darkness, until they got up close enough and they realized it was actually the rabbi, the elderly rabbi of the community, who was up and out and active in the snow very early before even the other younger congregants even got out and tried to make their way to shul. And when they asked him what the elderly rabbi was doing, he said, I realized that so much snow fell that it would be difficult for people to make their way out of their houses and to wherever they had to go, particularly the children who need to go to study Torah. And therefore, I took it upon myself to get up extra early on this day, despite it being, of course, very cold and snowy, to clear the paths away so that the children and the mothers would be able to make their way to the shul or to the marketplace, wherever they have to go. So you see the example of an elderly pious rabbi whose thoughts were not only in the very most elevated realms of Torah, but literally down low, on the ground, on the earth, thinking about the needs of your average regular people. And a third maybe idea that suggests this is the ladder of that Yaakov saw in his dream, Jacob's ladder, which said, Rosha Migya Shemayim Raglav Mutzav Arza. Right, the head of this ladder went way up to heaven, but the feet of the ladder are described as being properly, firmly planted on the ground. And that's understood to be Yaakov. Jacob's ladder is referring to a spiritual state, which was peculiar and unique to Yaakov, where he was very elevated, high up in Shemaim, but his feet were also firmly planted in this worldly matters. And he had this type of shlemus, this type of perfection, as a result of which angels, divine forces, literally went up and down the ladder, as the verses say. That Yaakov, in this way, became a conduit or channel through which divine influence was spread into the world. Why? Because his head was very high in Shemaim, in very lofty Torah and spiritual concepts, but his feet were also firmly planted on the ground, and therefore he was able to connect and span those two dichotomies, heaven and earth, and himself become the ladder or the channel through which the divine force corresponding to the angels would go up and down, up and down. And so this is the shlemus. I think these are three good examples of what we're referring to here as well, that a person should be mizdame to the keser, also in this third attribute, I think that actually the fourth, yes, the third, by not having a metzach kashe, not having a stern, disassociated aspect towards life, but rather be large-minded enough to be able to be engaged in Torah, but also bring it down and share it with the world in a positive way. That would be being soft-headed, I think, in this respect.